Yeah, my name is Joe Hallmark. I'm the Deputy Director of the Manhattan Outreach Consortium. In order to kind of give a better context of this pilot, I wanted to take just a few minutes to explain a little about the work that we do, because that's the work then we did with these individuals that were identified through the CPI Pilot. So in line with what Sam was presenting in this shift and how homeless services were offered in New York City, Goddard Riverside Community Center was awarded the contract for Manhattan. Specifically, we were contracted to provide housing placement services to homeless adults living on the streets. However, in order for Goddard to be as effective as possible, we actually formed a consortium, which we refer to as the Manhattan Outreach Consortium, a consortium of 4 agencies. And this allows us to actually dissect Manhattan into 7 what we refer to as catchment areas. And of the 4 agencies, we have 7 programs that work within those areas, providing more community-based services to those individuals living on the streets. The services that we provide, you could generally describe them as 24-hour housing and outreach services. This would include our teams are constantly on the street canvassing, looking for individuals that appear to be homeless or report being homeless, engaging them. And as we engage them, we will provide referral services when appropriate, but also begin to work with them in a housing process, namely completing housing packets, getting them connected with services that make them housing eligible. And then the next more important step is literally placing them into housing. Now, however, our goal being to put individuals into permanent housing, it's a lot harder to place somebody directly from the street. However, that's not to say that we haven't done that. Generally, though, we're more often placing individuals first into transitional housing and then into permanent housing. Because it plays heavily with the pilot, let me describe a little bit what we mean by transitional. I understand many of you may know what I'm already talking about, but for those that don't, transitional housing is, in a sense, just temporary housing where individuals have a place to stay indoors that's safe until we're able to get them to the point where they're ready to be connected with permanent vacancies and move in. The types of temporary housing we use, though, are very specialized. We don't utilize the city shelter system for our population. Instead, we utilize programs called safe havens, which are smaller shelters that are generally more supportive and have specific supportive services in place, actually at the site. Generally, these sites allow our clients to have either their own room or they'll share a room with perhaps one other person. The consortium also utilizes what we call stabilization beds, which for our program is we rent several beds at the Harlem YMCA, where individuals have their own room, and it's, once again, sort of kind of an area for them to stay that's safe, it's off the street, while we work with them towards permanent housing as our goal. But through the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to refer to this temporary housing solely as transitional. Now, while our clients are in temporary settings, we work with them there on getting entitlements, completing housing packets, connecting with supportive services to address other issues that they may have. And all of this is done with the ultimate goal of placing the homeless into permanent housing and, as we have it here, ending homelessness. Nice, right? Which is a lofty goal, but I kind of feel like that's why all of us in this room are here, is we're ultimately working to place these individuals, provide appropriate services, but we want to end homelessness. That proved to be difficult, but hopefully manageable, and we still continue to work on it. However, in this, I'd say this quest to provide the best services for those staying in Manhattan, we want to be sure that we're actually encountering everyone. And as Sam had sort of brought up, there is this group of individuals that we were not seeing on the streets despite our best efforts. And really, we literally have teams out in the field 24 hours a day scouring the streets looking for individuals. We're connected with community members, with businesses, and other organizations that can report these individuals to us. We can get out there and start to engage them. But even then, we have groups falling through the cracks. And hopefully the summary then gives us a good context to talk about why we partnered with Bellevue for this particular pilot. These individuals, and again, the acronym chronic public inebriates, it might not be the best description, and it certainly isn't one that we picked. But it's kind of out there. It's in the vernacular, so we adopted it so we can have a common language. I just want to put that plug out there. The in identifying these individuals that are chronically or more frequently using the ER and not being found on the street, we weren't really sure why. And even now, as this pilot has progressed, we're not exactly sure where the disconnect is. Perhaps they're spending most of their time in the hospital, and for that reason we don't see them. Or once they leave the hospital, they're going into very hard places to find. Maybe it's some nook, crack, or cranny, wherever, that we're not able to yet penetrate. But either way, what it shows is the hospital is the key. If we can't find them on the street, but the hospital knows who they are, that's where we need to connect with these clients in order to move forward in providing services with them. And so with that, we decided to come together, DHS, the Manhattan Outreach Consortium, and Bellevue, in order to develop this pilot, which we aptly named the CPI Pilot. All right. The first phase in this project was to identify the top users of the emergency department and those top users that were presenting with alcohol use disorder. So Bellevue had compiled a list of all those that had visited the ED the 2 years prior to our starting this project, generating a list of about 200 individuals. From that 200, they identified individuals that had at least 10 visits to the ER each year and were at least once given the diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. Additionally, though, just to make sure no one was being missed, the Bellevue staff also submitted names of those being seen at least 20 times in the last 24 months that were considered frequent users of the ED and were also given the alcohol use disorder. So these two processes of looking through the records and then also having staff input allow us to sort of generate this list of individuals that looked like they'd be eligible for this pilot. It was roughly about 56 eligible patients. From that point, some of the diligent researchers at Bellevue went through meticulously the records, which was a big endeavor, but to determine whether or not the records identified these individuals as street homeless through self-report or also from input with staff as they recognized that these individuals were clearly coming from the streets. After conducting these reviews and determining whether or not the individuals really fit the criteria as being CPI and also street homeless, we had a core group to work from. And in vetting it this way, we were ready to move forward in a partnership. However, as we all understand the need for confidentiality, we need to create a process in which their rights were protected, but we were able to connect with them as well. Bellevue developed an electronic system called the alert system, so that as these individuals who were identified as eligible for the pilot, when they presented at the emergency department, there were certain flags in the system that would alert the person in the system that this person was being or should be funneled to the pilot. From there, Bellevue staff were able to engage them and talk about the services the Manhattan Outreach Consortium provides, and if they were so willing to engage in this pilot, to have that individual sign a consent. With that consent, Bellevue was then able to contact us, and in that contact, they would provide us the name of the individual as well as a small data sheet that they would complete with the person while at the hospital. This data sheet included information on their homeless history and, most importantly, where they were at night and during the day in case we needed to contact them later if they left the hospital. With these data sheets and the client's name, we could then check our own databases as well as DHS's databases. The purpose of this is seeing, is this somebody who's already known to us and we're working with them, in which case we don't necessarily want to enroll them in the pilot. It also allowed us to see, is this person already in the shelter system and receiving services there. From there, generally that process should take no more than a day, and quite often teams are then able to, after vetting the name through our databases, go to the hospital to then do a more in-depth interview with the individual there. If the person had left the hospital before we were able to get to that point, we began looking for them on the street in the areas where the individual reported staying, or if not found outside, we would then wait for the next time that they presented at the ED in order to engage them at the hospital. This interview process kind of is the last step in determining eligibility for the official enrollment in the pilot, and allowed us then to determine, yes, these are one of the individuals that we want to focus on for this. And for the purpose of the pilot, it had evolved at certain times. We began with 20 individuals. Since then, we currently enroll 15 patients at a time for this pilot. There were budgetary reasons for this, as the pilot did not come with additional resources, but there were also practical reasons, as this was experimental and it wasn't ready for a huge rollout. But I do want to highlight, though, that this process is still ongoing as we move forward, working with those individuals on our caseload through this pilot. Bellevue continues to identify the next set. So as individuals come off the list for a variety of reasons, we have individuals ready to go to take the next spot as it becomes available. Actually, I'm sorry, jumping a little ahead here. All right, so hopefully that gives some context as to how we get these individuals sort of on our radar. But before moving on, I want to talk about ongoing services. The ongoing services, I think, can really be captured by my presentation on what the consortium does in general in providing housing services. But for the purpose of this pilot, it also somewhat goes beyond that. Both Bellevue and the Manhattan Outreach Consortium have decided to make the services more intensive. So for our part with MOC, we do set aside certain vacancies just for individuals in the pilot. We also try to prioritize them for those safe haven beds that have more supportive services associated with them. As individuals who are enrolled in the pilot present in the hospital, even though we connected with them that one time, we continue to receive alerts and are able to continue to engage them at the hospital. Generally, we try to do so within about an hour to get to the hospital and engage them there. As we found an interesting thing with this population, which I think highlights, again, why we're working with them in this manner, is that even after being identified for the pilot, working with them to get their self-reported daytime and nighttime locations, we were still not engaging them in the streets. We were checking those areas that they were, again, reporting that they were being in or even made sense for them to be staying in and weren't finding them. It really became the hospital as the hub for making contacts with them until we were able to place them into housing. For Bellevue's part as well, they also agreed to more intensive services and that they were connecting with clients in order to produce psych evaluations that we use for housing purposes, also to motivate clients to actually stay in the hospital until we got there. These frequent flyers often make their flights very short. They'll come in, they're briefly there, but then they leave quickly, and Bellevue tries to hold them for as long as they can, working within the legal constraints that apply to that. But in working together in collaboration, we're able to engage them more fully in the hospital until we get to the point where we're able to place them. And generally, from their housing sites, we're able to engage them further there. In addition to all this, Bellevue also began assigning each of the CPI patients care managers at the hospital, with their role being to coordinate care. They act as liaisons to the different departments there, but also with the consortium. They have a job in assisting with overseeing medical plans, largely around outpatient services after discharge. They also work closely with our teams in just regular case management, offering assistance and engagement, escorts to appointments, advocacy with housing, even advocacy within the hospital, and a host of other related services. So that was kind of a laundry list of sort of how the pilot works, but I thought this helps in order to then sort of conceptualize this process as it all comes together. It really begins here in this top right, as it's a system of checking the databases at Bellevue, speaking with staff, and identifying this group of potential eligible individuals. Doing a chart review, determine they really are street chronic, in which case the alert system's set up. Each time they present to the ED, if it's for the first time, as I'd mentioned before, the HIPAA consent and the data sheet are completed, and then we are alerted in order to check our database to see if they're already known, and then the team goes out there to interview them and determine their eligibility as the final step. Finally ending with we enroll them in there. But for those individuals that are now on the pilot, we sort of just stay in these two bubbles here, the alerts and the enrolled. We continue to get alerts as they arrive at the hospital. We arrive there to engage them and continue their housing treatment plan. So, outcomes so far with this pilot. As of April 30th, the pilot has served 26 individuals, 19 of which, I'm sorry, of that 19, one or more, they were placed at least one or more times. This accounts for about 41 transitional placements and 7 permanent placements. It's interesting, however, to kind of pause here as we look at those two bullets right there, 41 and 7. This really does kind of capture the quality of, or rather, how we have to work with these individuals in this context, that this is a very vulnerable population, especially with the alcohol abuse disorder. It adds an element of that makes it difficult, especially in the beginning stages of engagement and utilizing their housing services. We found that, especially with the transitional housing placements, we needed to make multiple placements. They may stay there for a little bit, but then they're lost to contact. They arrive at the hospital. At times, we're able to get them back into their bed. Other times, those beds were closed, and we needed to open new ones. Fortunately, we have patient providers working with us, namely the YMCA, I think, had the brunt of a lot of this. But in being able to work in this context and recognizing that this population needs that extra effort, needs that extra work, we are finding successes. And Lily's going to speak more to that, as will I. So going over, again, so 19 individuals were placed at least once of the 26. 2 of the 26 were already in transitional when they were enrolled in the pilot, and 5 individuals were never placed, rather choosing to stay on the street for that time. Currently, of the 15 patients who are enrolled and are active clients right now in this pilot, 6 of them are right now on the street, 5 of them are in transitional housing, and 4 of them are in permanent housing. However, those that are in transitional housing, the 5 individuals, at least 3 of them already have housing packets which are ready to go and waiting for permanent vacancies. The other patients that account for the full 26, 11 of them have been removed from the pilot. That is due to 3 lost to contact, 3 deceased, and 5 transferred to other programs. In addition to outcomes, or in addition to these outcomes, there's also a lot of other positive things, or I'd say like fruit born from this pilot. I'd say first and foremost, it allowed the MOC to connect with vulnerable street homeless that were not otherwise going to be encountered. And this is something I've already spoken to in this presentation, that we were not going to find these individuals any other way than at Bellevue Hospital, especially even after receiving their self-report as to where they stay during the day. This is a very fragile group, and it makes it difficult to encounter them on the streets, especially due to the transferring or the transports back and forth to the hospital. Further positive effects from this pilot has been having access to more intensive services at Bellevue for these pilot clients, and these intensive services as well have been vital to the success of these. I'd mentioned before just being able to get a psych eval for housing purposes makes a large difference, as well as the hospital's willingness to try and hold these patients in the hospital for a time that allows us to get there and engage with them in that setting. I also want to speak again about the care managers that I had brought up before. Their services, I mentioned just briefly what they bring to the table. But I'd say of all the things that they do, it's really the communication that helps the most in being able to communicate with somebody at the hospital that's responsible for a specific case, or may be aware of things that are going on at the hospital with our clients that aren't being reported to us. They can be the first line in that process to engage with us. And then finally, developing relationships with Bellevue as a result of this pilot has allowed us to work more closely with some of the staff at that hospital, with even some of our non-pilot clients when they presented and are admitted there. And really, I want to highlight that these are just a handful of some of the strengths, and that some of them speak directly to the pilot results, but other of them speak to strengths outside of, or things that we get outside of the pilot. However, we also want to talk about some of the weaknesses of this pilot from the team's perspective. And there's a lot of like minute things where we need to improve, or perhaps we need to change things, reformat them. I think that's really true of any pilot. However, I want to talk about 3 general areas in particular. One of them is limited resources, which, I mean, we expected going into this. We knew that we weren't necessarily going in with new monies for additional housing or staff specifically for these clients. But in providing the services, it really highlighted that we needed resources around specialized supportive housing with this. Our stabilization beds as a transitional housing option has been great because it gets these individuals off the street into a safer place, but they don't provide the intensive support that they need in order to have success there. And the supportive services that we do have access to, I mean, are limited, as all of us are familiar with. And with in this context of limited resources in addition to housing, also just the manpower involved. I don't think we were quite expecting how much manpower is going to be involved in this. We've been doing outreach services for quite some time and are used to working with difficult populations and so forth. But this took a lot of time, particularly not just with case management services, but with administration and being able to create this pilot, changes as it needed to, managing the data for this, also just the communications back and forth between the hospital and the consortium, which were vital, were also very time-consuming. Which is a good segue then into the other one, communication. We see that there's great room for improvement here, particularly around information sharing, which makes sense when you're dealing with an institution that's very large, but we need to have a realistic picture of there needs to be good information sharing despite the size of the institutions working together. This runs the gamut of getting good records that speak to where the client's at and things that we need to know in order to work with them more effectively, but it also goes with like active communication, being alerted as things occur, that all parties that are involved in this process are familiar with emergencies or even updates, change in plans. The alert system I mentioned before is and was pivotal to this pilot, also kind of highlighted an area in which we really need to improve, and is a good learning thing for us as we endeavor in similar work, and knowing that alerts as vulnerable clients present at different areas are vital, and that system needs to be fully functional. We still run into issues with the alert system, either not flagging individuals or those getting the alerts aren't then passing on the information. And then as well with communication, it's just developing, as we develop plans and so forth, is that including all the parties involved that need to be involved. And I think that also speaks a little bit to coordination. And probably the main thing that I'd want to highlight is perhaps a weakness to this pilot that we're working on, but also learning from in order to better this pilot and then our work in general. I mentioned before just the amount of manpower that this needed. We weren't quite as prepared for the infrastructure that was needed in order to carry out this project. It was much larger than anticipated in terms of not so much the involvement of the case managers. We knew that the case managers were going into this and were going to have a lot of work to do. They were going to get a lot of alerts, would have to get up and go, get to the hospital, that this population was perhaps going to be needier than other individuals on their caseload. All of this we knew and we expected, and the case managers rose to that occasion. It was more the level that the managers needed to be involved in order to coordinate this fully, and just receiving reports, gathering information, making changes to the pilot as needed, but also just keeping the lines of communication open and advocating for that so that we were able to stay on track. But beyond the staying on track was also to keep momentum and accountability, which I think momentum and accountability, those are elements of our work regardless of line staff, management, administration. But in order to have real success here, management, especially higher up in Bellevue and in DHS and MOC, management needed to be the ones that really drove the momentum and the accountability, and we're communicating that down. Finally, also, I've mentioned a couple of times the strengths with the care managers in this process, and which I still feel is really the case, but it was a good learning opportunity for us as we see this shifting in a lot of different areas, like this role of care managers or coordinators for larger systems. It's been helpful for us to see it in the context of this pilot, that when we look at our patients' care and what they need, you see that it's really difficult for just one entity to coordinate all of that. And I feel like the care managers are really trying and are successful in many ways, but without the hospital, the consortium doing their part, the best intention of the care managers, the best communication, so forth, would result in less. And wouldn't quite provide the coordination of care that we're looking for in this pilot or anything else that we create from it. All right. So I'm going to end there with our strengths and weaknesses and segue into Lily's part of the presentation as she presents further on some of these medical outcomes.